Well, Catherine's produced a very promising first effort, and we can see this throughout it. It's got a really strong structure to it. Start up at face value, and the judgment straight away completely supports the interpretation. She backs it up by talking of jingoism, the gotcha headline. I'm not quite sure what this fantasy war is here, so I put a bit of a question mark there, and that's not that clear. There's a spelling error there. So we have, she continues on this by continuing to back it up. We have our lads sinking the gun show, use of the first gunship. You've got the use of the first person here. The before and after photographs is something I hadn't really spotted. That's a very good idea. Tone. I'm not really sure what this small propaganda poster is again, so I've got another question mark there. Right. If we look beyond face value, that's it. That's the second part of the structure. So we start off looking at face value. Now we go beyond face value. And a judgment, again, only supports it to a small extent. Lovely. Why not? It's tabloid paper, prone to exaggeration. Making it a typical source, I'm not really sure what that adds to it. But we question its reliability, certainly. Public source. All these things, polemical, controversial headline. All these things in here show that Kat has obviously gone off and read those terms that I gave you earlier in the year. The prosperity and patriotism, I'm not really sure about the prosperity bit of that. Nevertheless, over here we can see that it continues in the same sort of way. And I love this point. This is a really interesting one, that directly after the war, Thatcher was more interested in a move to a more American worldview. Contradicts the sense of nationalism that the Sun presents. That's a nice idea. Lengthening the period, again, she's taken on this on board. And I love this paragraph here. Therefore, the source supports the interpretation to a moderate extent. Great. Always is problematic. And a more precise interpretation would consider the purpose of the Sun, Thatcher's future economic plans for Britain, and the length of the period where Jingo was still alive. Then it peters out. Now, of course, what we want there is for her to go further and to actually add, say, look, she said why it's problematic, what the problem is, and to write a new one. The new one's not there, and that's really what's lacking in this. So, if we're going for 2 stars and a wish, one of the stars would definitely be a strong structure. It's definitely building an answer. It's not just following a formula. It's building an answer. A second star would be how impressed I am with the risks that Kat's taking here, that she's coming up, she's experimenting with new ideas, she's experimenting with historical terms, and sometimes not getting it quite right, but it's the first effort, and I'm very, very impressed with that. The wish, as always, speaks for itself, and the wish is that you should add a new interpretation at the end. All this building up, building up, building up, I want to know what the new interpretation is, and it's lacking, it's not there. But a very, very impressive first effort, and it shows a real impressive amount of effort as well, and a bit of extra learning taking place outside, which is always very pleasing to see. Now, Prema's made a hugely promising effort and a very impressive start. Supports his statement to a large extent. She doesn't need to write all that out again, but she did. A judgment, that's nice and clear. Now, does she actually back it up? We talk about gotcha, our lads, the QE2 sailing, spelling error there, punctuation error there. Attitude was typical. It would be nice if that's backed up by knowledge of why it's typical, but then maybe at this stage of the course, Prema's not completely aware of all that, so I'll forgive that at this stage of the course. We can see then it starts looking at the provenance of the source. Conservative newspaper used for political purposes, attacks the Unionists. You could have expanded on the fact that the Unionists were against the war, and that would have that would show that not everyone was patriotic. I like this if you widen the time period, yeah, it talks about it being untypical. These are all lovely ideas. If throwback before 1916, it's building really nicely, and it said what's problematic. Therefore, we get the more accurate interpretation would be before 1916, the exception of the Falklands, blah 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 blah. That fits with what we were saying, and I think that's a very, very promising piece of work. So, if we're going to look for 2 stars on a wish on this, then obviously one of the stars is going to be it's extremely well structured, very pleasing to see. The other star I would say would be that it's just so pleasing to see her, very like Kat did, experimenting with different ideas and coming up. And I particularly like the use of knowledge. The contextual knowledge is really good for this stage, talking about it being a throwback, but being done in a way that adds value to the argument. And I also, I give it 3 stars and a wish really, but I also quite like the explaining why it's problematic in that way. The wish would be just really for this section here, just in there perhaps, to have, in between those 2 paragraphs, to have more of a link as to why it's lacking. I know it says that British people is problematic higher up, but something to just bring that forward a bit more. But it is, for a first effort, it's a very strong piece of work, and Prema can be very proud. Well, Joshua's made a very impressive effort, and the strongest part of it is his organisation of his answer. If we just look at his organisation, we have a face value, and as we go down then we can look, he's got the however where he puts the other bit, and then we have the conclusion, but he doesn't just conclude, he talks about why it's lacking and then suggests a new one, so it builds really nicely. So if I'm going to look at giving this 2 stars and a wish, that would definitely be one of the stars. To go through it, we can see that a face value completely agrees, and then he backs it up. Okay, well, he goes further than that, then backs it up. A face value, we have our lads, he talks about the word our, gotcha. If we look beyond face value, he mentions that patriotism was scarce. I'm not really sure that I agree with that Britain had just been through 2 wars and patriotism was scarce. I think I'd be talking more about the Cold War in that situation, but nevertheless, it's a valid point, I suppose. Britain have been, there we are, this was seen as an easy war. Now that's really important. I would like him to have put a bit more in this section about the section where it said that the Union boycotts the war, which shows that not everyone was supporting the war, and Britain was very split at this time. He doesn't really do that. But I like this conclusion. At face value, it completely agrees. But as we look past face value, you can see how focused he is in answering the question there, and he explains why it's lacking, writes a new one, and justifies why he needs to write it. So, therefore, to give this 2 stars and a wish, one of the stars is definitely the structure of it, really, really strong, very impressive. The other star is that everything's backed up and supported and evidenced, and that's quite impressive, although there is a lack of knowledge at the moment that will get stronger as the course goes on. And that's what my final one really is, that to bring more of that contextual knowledge, and certainly on this one to give you a precise example in there, to pick up that bit about the Union boycotts the war and talk about that. Well, Sam's work is a good example of someone who just needs to become a little bit more neutral in what they're saying. He's following a very good structure. We have at face value, we go beyond face value, and then he changes the interpretation. So he's doing everything that I expect him to do, and he makes some good points. I like the fact at face value this source does indeed show us blah, 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 blah. So that's nicely focused on the interpretation. He backs it up with words like gotcha, and he talks about it being in the main title, so it shows that it's great importance. Our lad sink gunboat, and so on. Okay, so at face value, he talks about it and backs it up quite well. There's a couple of little things about expression here. The sources at face value 100% suggests. I don't think that 100% is needed at all. Another expression bit down here is the article is from The Sun, which is a pro-war and has a means of propaganda. I know what Sam means, but it could be clearer, I think. Anyway, here we go. Beyond face value, it's not a worthy newspaper to have an unbiased view. Again, possibly expression there. I know what he means. It's a biased source. This is why I don't want people to use the word biased. I want you to explain exactly what it means. You can't say it's not a worthy newspaper to have a biased view. You need to explain what exactly the limitations of this source are. It's the biggest selling newspaper in the country. The Sun barely ever actually has proper news in it and tends to drift from factual content into its more political views. True, but this you've got to be very careful saying that. However, we do know at this time the Falklands War was a lot of British people did support it. Right, lovely. That would be nice if you could actually evidence that in some way and back it up with contextual knowledge. It's talking about it not being a total war, which is true. Okay, but the idea of it being a snapshot that's just worth just goes on for a few weeks would be quite an interesting one. I personally think the interpretation of the source is wrong. I've circled wrong. You should never say that. It's the interpretation is the source isn't wrong. The interpretation is nothing to do with the source. It's separate to it. It's not wrong. It's lacking. It's not the interpretation of the source anyway. You would say, as far as this source goes, this interpretation is lacking, or a better way is to say that the term 20th century is problematic because it is too general or something like that. So in terms of, well, British people are not patriotic in terms of what, except the Boer and Falklands. What about the beginning of World War One? So I think it's what I like about it is that it does build. I can see why he's arguing it, because the answer does build. But I just think the issue for Sam is going to be to do with precision, about being precise. Yeah, so 2 stars and a wish. First star is good. It's a good structure. We do at face value, we do beyond face value. He tries to bring knowledge in and so on, which is lovely. The other star would be that it's backing up the views very well. It's evidencing things, and he's also trying to think and use some historical language and communication and so on. The issue, really, the wish, is to do with being precise and saying precisely what you mean, and avoiding saying things like the Sun is a means of propaganda, it's not a worthy newspaper, and expressions like that, but say exactly what you mean. Again, though, very promising work. So Callum again gets the correct approach. He does face value, he goes beyond face value, and towards the end of the answer he rewrites the interpretation. There we go, just there. So that's great, that's all done properly. We're following the right thing, the right sort of approach, and he's sort of building an answer as well, which is good, rather than just following some sort of formula to it. Unfortunately, it's not backed up as precisely as I would like it to be, and there's also, I've just spotted now, there's an issue there with a capital letter. British should be obviously a capital letter. But looking here, he's correct. You know, he says our father's source supports it, and talks about, gives some examples. The examples could be a lot more precise than they are, though. And then we go beyond face value. There's a lot more you could put in here, a bit like gotcha, and the before and after pictures of Belgrano and things like that. But it could be more precise in that way. When we look at this bit, beyond face value, that's great. I believe that. I'd never use that sort of words. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just wasting your time. You just say beyond face value, this source largely disagrees. That's good, because you're linking it back to the interpretation again, which is great. We mentioned jingoism and patriotism in this war, and it was untypical. That's great, but it needs to be evidence. And to just say after the Age of Innocence that ended in 1916, it's not like there's some Age of Innocence that somehow ends in 1916. You need to be more precise about it. You need to say what exactly happens in 1916. I would be mentioning things like the Battle of the Somme, which made people more cynical of their government, and the Cold War that was happening at this time, and so on. I'd also be mentioning that that there are people who disagree with the interpretation. I mean, it's mentioned here, not all British supported it, but there's no mention of the, quote, Union boycotts war. I've sort of tried to ban the word biased. The Sun would be biased. We need to be more precise about what the Sun actually does. But anyway, nice here. To conclude, I believe the interpretation, and we have the interpretation. Then on the next page we have, I believe that a more accurate interpretation would be, which is great, but it's not explaining why it's being changed. It says it's only supported a little. Right? We need to say why it's not supported, and the key word there to be used would be problematic, of course. It's supported only a little by source 6 because this bit of it is problematic and therefore needs to be changed, and a better interpretation would be whatever. Okay, whatever you're going to put there. So, stars. Well, it's following the general right, correct approach to do it, and it's using a bit of knowledge and provenance to back up the source, which is exactly what I asked people to do. But the wish would be to be more precise in what you're saying, to be more precise in terms of the knowledge that backs it up, to be more precise in terms of the quotes you use, and to be more precise in terms of why you're adjusting the interpretation, not just because it's only supported a little. Why does it only support it a little? What bit is problematic about it? Another very promising answer, though.